2 years ago, Governor Hogan announced that he was removing degree requirements from all state jobs in the state of Maryland. So 30,000 jobs were suddenly available to workers who didn't have a bachelor's degree. He was tearing the paper ceiling. Well, in the 2 years that have followed, 25 other governors have taken similar actions, either through legislative action or through executive orders, to remove degree requirements on their public sector jobs. How many of you have heard of the paper ceiling? Oh, wow. It's about 25% of us, 30% of us in the room. The paper ceiling represents the barriers that workers face in the form of degree screens, algorithmic bias, misperceptions, and the lack of professional networks. I'm here today to talk about the paper ceiling and why it matters. My name is Papia Debroy, as Eddie says. I'm Chief Impact Officer at Opportunity at Work. I'm also a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And our organization has had the great honor of working with a lot of the leaders that have been taking this action in the last several years. We've worked with 17 of the 26 states on the previous page there, and more than 100 other public sector leaders. And we worked with dozens of private sector leaders who, when they make this choice, don't necessarily make the headlines, but are taking similar actions behind the scenes. Why are they doing this? I want to back up a little bit and actually talk about the US labor force a little bit. So today, there are about 140 million of us that are showing up to work every day. We're active in the US labor force. Of the 140 million of us, about 60 million have a bachelor's degree or a higher level of educational attainment. In the purple there, you see that there are 70 million workers who are skilled through alternative routes to the bachelor's degree. They have a high school diploma, do not have the bachelor's degree, but have been showing up to work, some of them for decades, and have been gaining very valuable skills. Higher education has always been a critical pathway in the United States to higher wage work. A lot of the stars, though, workers who are skilled through alternative routes, are gaining skills through community college, through military service. Most commonly, they reflect on the fact that they have gained skills by showing up to work every day, getting better at the tasks associated with their roles, and gaining very valuable skills for our US labor market. Today, in the United States, when a job requires a degree, we screen out a lot of the populations that we actually seek to bring into our organizations. So today, we screen out 68% of our Black workforce when we require a degree, 74% of our Hispanic workforce. We screen out 72% of our rural workforce and 64% of veterans. Yet these are workers who are gaining valuable skills. They face a lot of different types of barriers in thinking about how to translate their skills and their learnings into earnings in the US labor force. In the 10 years before 2020, almost 70% of new roles that were added to the labor market were ones where employers frequently require a degree, despite the fact that 50% of our workforce doesn't have one. We did an analysis with LinkedIn. We scraped all profiles on their website and found that degree holders have professional networks that are 3 times as strong as stars. And we find that they face a lot of misperceptions in the US labor force. More than 50% of managers believe that more than 50% of the workforce has a degree. And when a manager believes that, they are less likely to hire a worker without a degree, and they are less likely to invest in the workers on their teams who don't have a degree. The resulting impact is pretty stunning. So on the page here, you see in the purple on the bottom, a star. 30 years ago, when they entered the workforce, they're earning less than the blue line on top. That's to be expected. The worker with the higher education has always earned more in the US labor force. But what's surprising is when you track that star for 30 years, what you find is 30 years into work, the star is still not earning what the bachelor's degree candidate was earning on day 1 of work. This inequality is new. It's new to this generation. And so a lot of our work at our organization is about thinking about, well, if we looked past the degree and started to look at skills as a currency in the US labor market, what might we reveal? And what we started to recognize as we did a lot of qualitative work with stars was that many of them had a really strong belief that they could do so much more. They could bring so much more to the US labor force if we activated them. We were approached by the Ad Council a few years ago, and they said, we want to bring an asset-based way of thinking about the US labor force, and we like the term stars. We'd like to build a campaign around them. We launched this campaign with them about 2 years ago. It's called Tear the Paper Ceiling. And the intention of the campaign is to bring an asset-based frame to how we think about skills in America. What we have found has been pretty extraordinary in the last few years. Perceptions of who is skilled in America has been shifting in part because of this campaign. We find 4 in 10 employers today recognize the paper ceiling. 83% of employers are more likely to hire someone without a degree today than they were 2 years ago. And given that the STARS terminology is pretty young, it's 5 years old, we find that 15% of stars are identifying themselves as stars at work today. I'm curious, as all of us reflect on our roles, how many of us would say that we use the majority of skills that we're bringing to work today, we learned on the job? How many would say the majority of skills you're using are ones you've gained through school? Different rooms are different. In this room, we see the majority of folks are reflecting on the skills that they've gained at work. And I think one of the things that's so critical about that insight is that as we start to think about what that means, how do we start to give credit to workers for the skills that they're gaining on the job? And how might we think about potential in the US labor market if we were anchored in that concept? This is a body of work we've published with a few co-authors over the last few years, but it's anchored in this very basic operationalization. What if we gave everyone credit for the skills required in their job description today? You could create a vector of skills and start to understand, well, how might we think about the transferability of these skills to other jobs in the US labor market? Here's an example on the page here. A retail worker is required to bring persuasion, active listening, service orientation to their job every day. There's actually a vector of 35 skills attached to this role. If we think about all the other jobs in the US labor market, these skills are very transferable. In fact, the job that you see workers make transitions into that pays more is the sales representative, the skills vector you see on the right there. More than 100,000 workers have made this transition in the last 5 years alone. You see almost a similar number of bachelor's degree candidates have made this transition as well. What becomes really interesting then, though, is if you assign this vector to the 140 million of us that are showing up to work every day, most of us make transitions to jobs that require very similar skills to our previous jobs. And what you start to see is how much unrealized potential there is in the US workforce. In fact, there are 30 million workers today showing up to work every day with skills to make transitions to significantly higher wages if they were given access and opportunity to those jobs. Now, what becomes interesting next is how we start to think about pathways where workers can start to continue to translate their skills. So here's an example here. Same concept, right? You're taking the skills as a cashier, making transitions into being a customer service rep, moving on to being a sales rep. These skills-based pathways that exist in the US labor market give us some clues about how these skills are actually translating into higher wage work. What we find is 4 stars, when they make transitions that are upwardly mobile, they move to a subset of jobs historically in the United States. We call these jobs gateway and destination jobs. They're jobs where you can gain skills in lower wage occupations, you can translate those skills into middle wage work, and you can gain economic mobility over time. They're really critical skills to the upward mobility of the US labor force over the last several decades. What's interesting about these pathways is when you study them, they're not traversed equitably by different groups. Black and Hispanic workers are less likely to get access to the transition. When they make the transition, they're earning less than their white counterparts. And we see a similar story for women. But these jobs matter a lot because they have historically provided that mobility to this population. Now, what becomes really interesting is how we might understand how those jobs have changed. So in the years between 2000 and 2020, there was a drastic shift in what economic opportunity looked like in precisely those jobs. So if you go back to the year 2000 and you look at all gateway and destination jobs in the US labor market, stars comprised 55% of the workers in those jobs. Now, a lot has happened since the year 2000. The labor market has changed. Gateway and destination jobs have actually grown proportionate to the labor market, but stars gained access to fewer than 10% of precisely those jobs. Now, what's been interesting since 2020, and you'll see this on the right-hand side of the slide for you all, is that some of that trajectory has shifted. We're starting to see stars be able to enter more and more of those jobs in the last several years. In some respects, the downward trajectory of opportunity has been arrested. Now, what comes next is an exciting proposition for us, right? In the next 5 years, across all of us, we will make more than 60 million hiring decisions. Many of those hiring decisions into gateway and destination jobs, many of them into new-to-world jobs, jobs that we've been talking about today, some of which we can't even name yet. And part of what is exciting about this opportunity is when we decide who's skilled in America, we also get to decide who gets access to those roles and how they experience economic opportunity in the United States. These choices are really important for what that looks like, not just in our workplaces, but in our communities. There's so much that we have been learning this last day here at the organization, and I think as you go home, I would love for you to think about a couple of things. The first is, I would love for us to really sit with, what does it mean to gain a skill in the context of the way work is transpiring today? Can we rethink some of the ways that we have historically looked at this information? The second is, let's remove degree requirements from gateway and destination jobs. Let's rethink whether the role like HR assistant, computer support specialist, secretary really does need that degree requirement. And third, all of us wear many hats every day, whether it be as an executive, as a teacher, as a researcher, as a parent. Many of us are employers, right? How might we think about our role in these ecosystems to actually drive more inclusion in the labor market? We at Opportunity at Work are on this journey with a lot of absolutely extraordinary scholars, employers, and many other partners, and we would love for you to join us. QR codes are up here. Thank you so much for your time today.